Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. A Google search for global warming turned this article up yesterday. We prefer Greenland icy, not green. It's not just a problem in the southern hemisphere either. Scientists believe that 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise may be locked in from glaciers in Greenland that seem to be set to melt regardless of what we do now. 140 years of records regarding ice sheet height and rates of glacial melting in the Jacobshavn Basin indicate that there may be a feedback effect that causes rapid ice loss. Then he went on with more pseudoscience hysteria and included this chart as evidence for his claims. Many glaciers, like the Jacobshavn Glacier in Greenland, have been retreating since the industrial era. The concern is that soon their loss may be locked in regardless of future reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Credit NASA. So let's take a closer look at the Jacobshavn Glacier. Almost all of the melt which occurred there occurred between 1850 and 1953. Over the past 70 years, the melt has been much slower. And NASA says that the Jacobshavn Glacier has been growing for the last few years. So the glacier was melting very rapidly in 1850 when carbon dioxide levels were low, but now the glacier is actually growing with carbon dioxide levels higher. Greenland's other famous glacier, the Petermann Glacier, is also growing. It's grown quite a bit over the past 10 years. This graph shows the Greenland's surface mass balance over the last 6 years. The surface mass balance is the difference between ice accumulation and melt off of the surface of the ice sheet. For 4 of the last 6 years, including this year, the accumulation of snow and ice on the surface has been above the 1981 to 2010 average. This summer has been particularly interesting with the surface mass balance above average every single day over the past month. The popular claims that Greenland is melting down are simply not true. The author's entire premise is based on this idea that the glaciers have been retreating since the industrial era, which implies that carbon dioxide is the cause. But now that carbon dioxide levels are higher, the glacier is growing. So his premise does not withstand scrutiny. Now let's take a closer look at the headline. We prefer Greenland icy, not green. Let's explore the question of how Greenland got its name. These graphs of Earth's temperature history are from the 1990 report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They show that Earth has regularly taken very large swings in temperature over the last million years. The warmest period of the last 10,000 years occurred about 5,000 years ago. And the warmest period of the last millennium occurred around the year 1200 when the Vikings were settling Greenland. The Vikings named it Greenland because it was relatively green. But then when the weather turned cold, the Viking population of Greenland was wiped out. The New York Times reported on this in 1934. Changing climate indicated an Arctic. Professor Griggs traces fate of lost Norse colonies to increasing Greenland cold. He pointed out that buried bodies of Vikings had been pierced by tree roots and that there's no longer trees growing in those areas. Professor Griggs' premise is that trees could not have grown in now perpetually frozen ground in Greenland. The world went from very warm around the year 1200 to very cold around the year 1600. The cold was not only catastrophic to the people of Greenland, but also to many countries in Europe, where a large percentage of the population died. Now let's take a look at the warm period about 5,000 years ago. According to the Geologic Survey of Norway, the Arctic Ocean may have been periodically ice-free around the time when Stonehenge was built. July temperatures along the northern coastline of Russia may have been 2.5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than they are now. And trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Canada, where the tree line is now 100 kilometers further south. Earth was much warmer 5,000 years ago when carbon dioxide levels were lower. Once again, we see that carbon dioxide does not control the Arctic climate. The Vikings settled Greenland when it was warm and named it Greenland. Then they got wiped out by the subsequent cold and ice. But in the middle of the 17th century, the Earth began to warm again. Alaska's most famous glacier at Glacier Bay melted very rapidly from 1780 to 1860. In 1958, the New York Times reported on a general loss of glacial ice around the world, as well as a retreat of Arctic sea ice. Lately, conspicuous changes have taken place in some of the ice. Glaciers in the western United States, for example, have lost 50% of their ice in the last 70 years. The floating ice of the Arctic is one-third thinner and covers a considerably smaller area than it did 60 years ago. Mountain glaciers in the Alps and in several other parts of the world, in addition to glaciers in the western United States, have actually been melting away quite rapidly for several decades. And some brilliant academics had proposed opening up Arctic shipping by breaking up the Arctic ice with nuclear weapons. In 1939, the leading Arctic expert, Dr. Hans Allman, said all of the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. It may, without exaggeration, be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. He documented the retreat of Norwegian glaciers, this picture in 1869, 1933, and 1946. The glaciers were melting very rapidly. In 1923, Glacier National Park was melting so quickly that experts predicted all of the ice would be gone before the year 1950. But the glaciers are still there in Glacier National Park and have actually been growing over the last 30 years. Like in Greenland, the glaciers in Glacier National Park retreated very quickly from 1850 to 1960, but now those same glaciers are growing. Temperatures at the North Pole have been below the 1958 to 2002 average every day for the past 2 months, and the North Pole may be having its coldest summer on record. And last winter was the coldest winter on record in Antarctica. The author says he prefers Greenland icy, not green, but the Vikings who froze to death there probably preferred it green. They settled Greenland because it was green around the year 1200, but when it turned icy, they froze to death. Now let's take a closer look at the author of this article. He lives in Australia and describes himself as an all-round automotive enthusiast. I assume he's aware of the fact that automobiles emit carbon dioxide. He most likely writes his articles from the comfortable indoor environs of fossil fuel heating and air conditioning. Lewin says he's worried about sea level rise, but sea level at Sydney is actually lower now than it was 110 years ago. The high water mark at Fort Denison in Sydney Harbor is about the same now as it was in the 19th century. The only change which has occurred at Sydney beaches over the last 130 years is the appearance of climate crazies dressed in red. Writing from fossil-fueled powered comfort in Australia, Lewin said he prefers Greenland icy, not green. The Vikings who named Greenland and then froze to death when it turned cold probably would have disagreed with him. And Lewin, the automotive enthusiast, is blaming the retreat of glaciers on the industrial era of man. When your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Journalists generally have no understanding of climate history, and they've been taught to blame everything which occurs on carbon dioxide. Much of mankind has always suffered from the afflicted belief that everything centers around human beings. They believe that changes in weather and changes in climate had to have been caused by human beings. They can't accept the fact that there's much larger forces in the universe than puny humans. It's the same mentality from 600 years ago when the orthodoxy refused to accept the fact that Earth was not the center of the universe. Carbon dioxide forms the basis of all life on Earth. It might be best not to demonize it. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this nonsensical journalism for the past 14 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.